Donald Trump thought tariffs were just numbers, just lines in a budget, just leverage. But what he didn't count on, what his ego refused to even consider, was that Canada wasn't going to fight back with bullets or bluster. They were going to fight back with silence. And now that silence is screaming louder than any speech on Capitol Hill. Canada's quiet revolt.
If you're done watching corrupt elites rig the system and leave you behind, subscribe now. If you want real talk, raw truth, and zero spin, this is your channel. If you're ready to fight back, hit that subscribe button and stand with us.
The boycott, the retreat, the refusal has sent American border towns into economic freefall. Tourism is drying up. Main streets are closing down, and small business owners in states like Maine, Vermont, and Michigan are watching their peak summer seasons vanish like smoke. They didn't vote for this. They didn't start this. But they're paying the price. Because Trump doesn't negotiate. He dictates. And when Canada refused and kneel, he did what he always does. He escalated. Steel tariffs. Aluminum tariffs. Agricultural threats. Rhetoric about absorbing Canada as the 51st state. What started as a trade policy became a diplomatic insult, a slap across the face to a nation that has stood by the U.S. in wars, trade deals, and crises. Trump called it strength. Canada called it what it was, bullying. And when Canadians heard their Prime Minister, Mark Carney, calmly announce retaliatory tariffs and remind citizens that tourism dollars are votes in disguise, they listened, not because they were angry, but because they were proud of their country, proud of their sovereignty, and proud to show the world that dignity doesn't require a megaphone, just conviction. So they stayed home. No border crossings. No weekend getaways to upstate New York. No family shopping trips to outlet malls in New Hampshire. No seafood tours in Maine. It was quiet, intentional, strategic, and it hit like a hurricane. Between February and April, border crossings from Canada into Maine fell by 26%. That's not a political statistic. That's lost revenue, empty motels, closed diners, and bankrupt souvenir shops. Local economies built on good faith and weekend cash just collapsed under the weight of one man's ego. Trump didn't see it coming because he never looked at Canadians as equals, only as economic tools. And that arrogance? It cost him. Governor Janet Mills of Maine went on television practically begging Canadians to come back. "We love our Canadian visitors," she said. "Please don't punish our workers." But here's the thing. No one is punishing anyone. Canadians didn't launch this. They're not boycotting America. They're withdrawing support from disrespect. They're making a statement without a single protest sign. A statement that says, if you treat us like a colony, you won't get our cash. If you mock our sovereignty, you won't get our business. This is an outrage. It's dignity. It's strategy. And it's working. Trump's tariffs haven't saved American jobs. They've destroyed them. Construction costs are up. Manufacturing prices have soared. Auto plants in the Midwest are reporting material shortages because steel costs have risen by up to 10%. And while Trump stands on stage bragging about winning the trade war, small-town factories are quietly laying people off. That's the real story. Not the shouting, not the spin, but the silent devastation creeping across America's industrial belt. And it's not just steel. Canada's counter-tariffs have targeted everything from U.S. yogurt to bourbon to farm equipment. Precision strikes. Smart economics. They're not trying to break America. They're trying to break Trump's spell over American voters who believe his policies were about patriotism instead of power plays. Every time a family in Wisconsin sees milk prices rise, every time a bartender in Kentucky sees bourbon shipments stall, every time a contractor in Ohio sees a supply line get disrupted, they start to ask questions. And those questions aren't, how can Canada do this to us? They're, why did Trump start this in the first place? And that's when the spell breaks. Because when your neighbor, your ally, your partner 150 years says, enough, and walks away from your store, your hotel, your town, that's not war. That's awakening. Canada didn't just push back. They disengaged. And now, Trump is feeling the heat. He's lashing out in speeches, blaming Justin Trudeau, accusing Carney of economic terrorism, and threatening even harsher tariffs. But it's too late. The narrative has shifted. This isn't about protecting American workers. It's about Trump failing American workers. It's about him choosing pride over partnership, optics over outcomes. Carney, on the other hand, never raised his voice, never took the bait. He didn't need to, because his strategy was never about beating Trump at his own game. It was about refusing to play it. While Trump tweeted threats, Carney met with G7 leaders, quietly building a new trade alignment. While Trump insulted Canada, Carney was forging new deals with the EU, Asia, and Latin America. While Trump broke down the house, Carney was rebuilding the neighborhood. And now the world is watching. Canada is being praised for measured leadership. Carney's calm has become a diplomatic currency. And every dollar not spent in American border towns is now flowing into local Canadian tourism, domestic manufacturing, and global partnerships that don't depend on the mood swings of a president. Trump, meanwhile, is left holding a shattered relationship, and no one to blame but himself. Even Republican lawmakers are getting nervous. Lawsuits are stacking up. Businesses are pushing back. There's talk of congressional reviews on executive tariff powers. And behind closed doors, GOP strategists are whispering, "This boycott is killing us." But the damage is done. Canada's silent stand has turned into a political earthquake. What started as a drop in tourism has become a rebuke of an entire worldview, a rejection of arrogance, nationalism, and transactional diplomacy. Trump tried to strong-arm a friend. Canada walked away with its spine intact. And in the process, they reminded the world of something critical. Respect is not given to the loudest voice. It's earned through leadership consistency and, yes, silence. Because sometimes the quietest protest is also the most powerful. And sometimes dignity wins. When diplomacy fails, markets respond. Donald Trump treated Canada as a bargaining chip. And when Canada refused to play, he doubled down without thinking through the real-world consequences. The result? A domino effect so powerful, it's reshaping the economic landscape of the entire northern border. It began with tourists, but it didn't end there. Canadian buyers pulled back from cross-border car leases. Credit card cross-border spending fell by nearly 20%. Even online sales dipped. Canadian shoppers who once flocked to U.S. retailers like Amazon and Walmart began seeking domestic alternatives or turning to global e-commerce platforms instead. That wasn't just lost American revenue. It was lost engagement. Each time Trump raised the tariff threshold, Canadian consumers quietly recalibrated their habits. And while governors begged for mercy, provinces invested in local brands. What was once made in the USA was quietly being replaced with made in Canada. Parkas, electronics, skincare, furniture. A subtle shift, one that relies on quiet marketing, patriotic labeling, and gentle encouragement from provincial governments. Rural manufacturing towns, once enduring overdependence on U.S. suppliers, began seeing new factories open, geared for domestic consumption. Some received incentives to ship production to serve Canada's eastern corridor from Halifax to Montreal. Others positioned themselves as Atlantic supply hubs, bypassing American ports entirely. Elon Musk's gigafactory in Quebec, that once felt like an American transplant. Now it's marketed as a Canadian clean energy beacon meant to decouple Canada's green tech future from Trump's America. Border towns on both sides of the line started to mirror each other, but with a crucial difference. Canada rebuilt. The U.S. just watched. Tech disruption and cross-border innovation migration. It's more than material goods. It's also intangible. Intellectual property, cloud services, AI labs. U.S. startups that once opened labs in Toronto, Vancouver, or Montreal as a gateway to NAFTA are now reevaluating. They're seeing regulatory instability, tariff threats, and cross-border friction, and pivoting to Canadian-held entities to serve both U.S. and global markets. Co-working spaces in Toronto, once full of Midwestern tech firms, are now hosting Silicon Valley talent. Here's a big one: artificial intelligence and government-funded test beds. Canada rolled out a $600 million federal fund for AI development across Ontario and Quebec, not long after Trump threatened Canadian universities with visa restrictions. As American institutions buckle, Canada is snarling talent. Picture it. Researchers from AI labs at U.S. universities quietly apply for dual positions, one at MIT, the other at Vector Institute. Over time, Canada's talent magnet grows. Those researchers take their projects north. Those projects grow into startups. Those startups attract venture capital. And suddenly, the next wave of tech innovation, jobs, patents, breakthroughs, is happening in Canada first. It's a long game, but Carney is playing it. He knows the world is watching. And while Trump tries to build walls, Canada is building bridges. Financial flows and capital realignment. Banks started noticing capital movement. Global funds are shifting assets. Canadian pensions, once constrained by NAFTA-era U.S. exposure, aren't afraid to rebalance into domestic industries. That stabilizes the dollar and attracts foreign investors, lionized by Carney's stable policy environment. Further, MSCI and FTSE have begun adjusting global indexes, in part due to widening risk spreads on U.S. utilities and transportation firms near the border. American investors are now paying higher risk premiums just because Trump decided to gamble with Canada. Insurance arms of multinational banks are refusing long-term underwriting for cross-border asset protection in regions like Vermont, Quebec, and Washington, D.C. You can't just defy diplomacy without creating capital flight, not without real consequences. Redrawing the supply chain map. In the auto sector, supply chains are mid-reckoning. Parts once fabricated in Windsor and shipped to Detroit are now staying within Ontario or shifting to Mexico. Suppliers are shifting Canadian OEM partners to minimize cross-border friction. In textiles, main garment factories closing, textile producers in Nova Scotia are expanding. When Maine saw Canadian investment to fill TVA ledger shortfalls, they were told, "Sorry, trust Canada's stability, not Trump's tariffs." Even food logistics are being rerouted. Specialty Adirondack maple syrup now meets Quebec maple syrup in Montreal-bound containers, traveling south after being consolidated in Canada to avoid multiple U.S. import duties. Legal front lines and federal pushback. American border states, from Minnesota to New York, aren't waiting. Lawsuits are in progress. Federal judges granted preliminary injunctions halting tariff implementation. But even if the injunctions hold, injunctions don't repair broken relationships or recapture the tourist dollars already lost. While federal courts mired Trump in legal delays, Carney's Ottawa won't build a lawsuit. They'll wait for the injunction to expire. And by then, Canadian infrastructure and brand loyalty will be stronger. In a parallel move, U.S. exporters comply with Canadian counter-tariffs are asking accident law firms in Ottawa to file for compensation under NAFTA Chapter 11-like mechanisms. The U.S. government risks losing the long memory of border towns. It's one thing to fight a trade war. It's another to lose the goodwill of millions of neighbors. In places like Buffalo, Niagara Falls, and Blaine, Washington, local American businesses built their lifelines around Canadian foot traffic. Canadians bought gas, booked hotels, shopped for everything from groceries to designer clothes, and fueled entire tourism sectors. But Trump's trade war broke something deeper than economics. It fractured trust. And when trust is gone, even the most scenic waterfall isn't enough to bring people back. The long memory of border towns is now a cautionary tale for governors and mayors. Business owners who used to hang bienvenue signs now face the quiet reality of no-shows, empty storefronts, and staff layoffs. And as they plead with Washington for relief, the federal response has been a cocktail of indifference and deflection. For Canadians, that silences everything. So instead of road trips south, they're spending weekends exploring the Maritimes, booking lake cabins in Ontario, or discovering Indigenous-owned eco-resorts in BC. The money stays home. The culture deepens. The message is clear: respect us or lose us. Trump's diplomacy vacuum becomes Carney's opportunity. While Trump tweets from golf courses and bullies allies on national television, Mark Carney is holding private meetings with Nordic leaders, signing clean energy memorandums with the EU, and launching new economic corridors with Asia-Pacific partners. Canada isn't waiting for America to fix itself. It's carving out new roles in global governance. Carney knows that power vacuums don't last. If America won't lead with integrity, someone else must. Under his leadership, Canada is co-sponsoring WTO reform initiatives, floating a new Arctic Council framework and working behind the scenes to stabilize commodity markets. From climate accords to water-sharing compacts, Carney is filling the gaps Trump left behind with diplomacy that's quiet, inclusive, and strategic. And it's winning him allies. From Berlin to Tokyo, leaders trust Carney's consistency. They see Canada as the adult in the room, and that's elevating its global stature far beyond its population size or military might. Media contrast, rage versus reason. In the U.S., cable news turned tariffs into gladiatorial theater. Pundits cheered Trump's bombast as if economics were a wrestling match. Crush Canada. Stand strong against our neighbors. As if the border were a battlefield and not a thread of shared prosperity. Meanwhile, Canadian media told a different story. Editorials weren't full of vengeance. They were full of resolve. They explained why dignity matters. Why trade is a two-way street. Why it's not about punishing America, but protecting Canada. In French and English alike, newspapers ran columns emphasizing unity, responsibility, and calm leadership. The difference couldn't be starker. In America, performative rage. In Canada, principled resistance. Carney's use of institutional power. Carney didn't just rely on soft diplomacy. He wielded institutional power with precision. He activated Canada's Export Development Bank to support companies pivoting away from U.S. dependence. He directed the Canada Border Services Agency to implement real-time terror tracking, identifying which American states would feel the most pain. He empowered provincial premiers to draft regional trade strategies independent of Washington's mood swings. Even Canada's education sector joined the resistance. Universities created new scholarships for students displaced by U.S. visa chaos. They inked deals with European research labs, decoupling from fragile partnerships in the U.S. The result? Canada's intellectual ecosystem became a sanctuary from Trump's chaos. Farmers fight back on both sides. In Canada, dairy cooperatives and grain unions rallied behind Carney's counter-terror strategy. They knew the long game. While Trump mocked Canada's overpriced milk, Carney protected agricultural subsidies and set up emergency rural investment programs. In the U.S., it wasn't long before Midwest farmers, who had once cheered Trump's toughness, began to revolt. They watched soybean exports collapse, machinery prices rise, fertilizer costs spike, all because Trump wanted to flex on Canada. One Iowa farmer put it bluntly, "We didn't elect him to bankrupt us. We elected him to help us." But help never came. Only tariffs, tweets, and more isolation. The ethical divide widens. What this trade war truly exposed wasn't just economic fault lines. It was an ethical divide. Trump's America believes might makes right, that allies are expendable, that loyalty is transactional. Carney's Canada believes leadership is earned, that treaties matter, that strength is shown through protection, not domination. The world noticed. In global summits, Canada is now a top invitee. When Latin American nations discuss supply chain resilience, Carney's office was consulted. When Indo-Pacific countries wanted green investment, they reached for Ottawa, not Washington. In trying to shrink Canada's role, Trump only amplified it. Culture and soft power surge. As Americans binge-watch drama unfold on 24-hour news, Canada quietly launched cultural diplomacy campaigns. New Canadian TV series debuted globally on Netflix. Canadian musicians, authors, and chefs gained attention. Embassy-led cultural fairs in Europe featured Indigenous art and French-Canadian film retrospectives. Canada's story was getting told, not as a passive neighbor, but as a dynamic, pluralist democracy thriving under pressure. While Trump's brand burned, Carney built a new Canadian narrative. Strong, calm, principled, and independent. The cost of arrogance. Trump thought he could bully Canada into submission. What he got instead was a full-fledged economic and diplomatic backlash. A rebellion not of armies, but consumers, business owners, and thoughtful policymakers. He underestimated Carney. He underestimated Canadians. And he underestimated the cost of arrogance. What began as a petty terror stunt has turned into a historic rupture. One that will take years to repair, if it ever can be. And in the ruins, Canada isn't just surviving, It's thriving, quietly, powerfully, without Trump. And that, above all, is a lesson.